Yeah, thanks, Tim. North Aurora is located off of I-88 and Route 56. Can you guys hear me back there? Yeah, okay. So our road network is basically 77 centerline miles of roadway. Majority of it's asphalt. We have 3 state highways coming through town, 56, 31, and 25. The town surrounds the Fox River, and generally that's how development began, closest to the river, and then expanded from the east and the west on either side. We do have some arterial streets that we're responsible for, mainly Oak Street and Randall Road in town. But other than that, the county helps us out by taking responsibility for our larger arterial roads like Orchard Road and part of Randall as well. The funding sources for the Village of North Aurora are primarily capital funding. So we try to use all of our capital funding on the road program because we can avoid some of the regulations that IDOT imposes on the larger maintenance programs. I've worked in communities where you try to keep the MFT money out of the road program as best you can to avoid those regulations, but I've also worked in communities where you try to put MFT money into the contract, which is a little bit more unusual, but there's situations where some municipalities have ordinances that might be a local bidder preference, and so there might be a local bidder that may have an advantage if you're using only capital funding, whereas the state won't allow that ordinance into a contract like that, so you're saving a little bit of money by including that IDOT funding in the contract. We also do our best to apply for STP fundings, and we use our MFT to leverage those dollars primarily, and we use MFT for preventative maintenance type activities. We attempt to apply for grants when they're available. We've been most successful with CDBG, Community Development Block Grant funding through the county. The DCEO grants and the ITEP grants we've been less successful for, but I think we're finding that if we do have designs ready in the queue, that they're a little bit more appealing to those making the decisions for those grant fundings.
Thank you, John. Kent?
Thanks, John. City of Elmhurst is pretty similar in a lot of ways to North Aurora. We're really bounded by a lot of state highways. Route 83 on the west, Butterfield Road, which is 56 on the south, and then we have 294 and 290 on the east, and again 290 on the north. So we're really surrounded by this network of freeways. So our community is mainly residential streets. We have 150 centerline miles, and primarily kind of similar to North Aurora, we use a lot of our capital fund, our general fund. We historically have not used MFT for roadway work, but we are now switching over to that a little bit, just because the regulations are changing. We primarily use that for salt purchases and snow plowing efforts, things like that, but we're trying to stretch that source. As far as other grants, we've been very successful with STP dollars, probably because our ADTs are pretty high, being in the eastern edge of DuPage County, and having the luxury of Waze sending everybody through our community when there's any accidents on the highways. We typically have higher ADTs compared to some of our neighbors, and that ranks us a little bit higher in some of the scoring for those STP dollars. So that's a quick overview, and I'll pass it along.
Good. Thank you, Kent.
All right, thank you. So again, not to repeat, but it's very similar in a lot of the same ways. The Village of Montgomery is surrounded by the Fox River as well, or has the Fox River running through it, I should say. The Village of Montgomery has several state highways that run through it. That would be Route 25, Route 31, Route 30, and we also have the major county thoroughfare of Orchard Road running through our village. The Village of Montgomery is set up with 75 center lane miles of roadway. It's about 70% of that of which is residential, 30% being arterial and collectors. The village funding-wise, we have in 2014, the village passed a sales tax referendum, which was 1% on sales tax that we use in our IRP funding, which is our infrastructure road program. That is what we generally use for the bulk of our funding. However, we do alternate years with the local IRP funds with MFT funding. So each year, we alternate between those two funding sources to achieve our projects. We've also done projects with SDP funds. We've been successful with that in the past. We have several of those right now that are in the queue for future projects, so we'll continue using those moving forward.
Thank you, Mark. And I just want to emphasize one of the things that Mark and his shop does is have those MFT funds roll over so that you have a larger amount, recognizing that it's a burden to do an MFT project, and sometimes the amount that we have is pretty minimal. So doing it every other year, I think, is a really good idea on how to stretch your dollars. So let's start at the beginning with pavement management programs. If you have a pavement management program, let us know, and if so, how is it being used?
Yeah, our pavement management program, we kind of actually almost to a T selected a company using the way Tim described earlier in his presentation. About 5 years ago, we went out for an RFP for different companies to offer their proposals to submit their statements of qualifications that we could examine and then determine kind of which company was the correct fit for the Village of North Aurora. There are a lot of different products out there. Some have proprietary software, some have open source software. Some present various options with their software to analyze all the data for you, and then there's others that just present the raw data for you, and you can kind of do with it what you may. I've been on both ends of that spectrum in the past. Most recently, I've kind of gone back to the raw data, and we're kind of just using a spreadsheet and Excel, kind of analyzing the data on our own. I think the more familiarity you have with your own community and the longer you've been there, you kind of get a better understanding of how the pavements are behaving just from a subjective standpoint, but it's always good to rely back on that objective data to confirm what your suspicions were in the beginning. So I think the more complicated thing for the Village of North Aurora coming up with the pavement management software is just incorporating that into the overall infrastructure needs of the community as a whole. So when you're considering the pavement network, you're also taking into consideration if you have a street that's up for rehabilitation, are you doing the sanitary sewer and water main underneath that street if it's in the pavement at that time? And conversely, maybe you have had a street in town that's had 4 water main breaks and there's some patches on it, but otherwise the road's in great condition. Is that now a candidate for water main replacement, and do you have to substitute that into your road maintenance program a little sooner? So that's kind of the way the Village of North Aurora has been looking at things.
As far as Elmhurst, we started a pavement management program at the height of COVID, so it hasn't been adopted. We're kind of working through the kinks. We did the same process where we did an RFP and selected a consultant. They drove the town, and then we had a lot of issues with the data, so we're trying to work through those issues. During COVID, we had one of our engineering staff member positions cut, so obviously there was more work to be done by the smaller group of people. So we're trying to bring it back to the forefront probably this winter. It also didn't help that during COVID, we skipped a year of paving to help with the general fund, and so that kind of threw off some of our initial plans. So I would say we're at the point where hopefully we'll have one adopted in early '23, and then our staff is expecting that, or at least the consultant's telling us our staff can be trained and modify the program, so we'll see how that training goes, but definitely curious to see how it's implemented, how often we use it. Do we go back to spreadsheets, or our street superintendent driving the streets and creating their own list? Which is what we had done previously. And I will say it's probably a lot of the communities here, your street superintendents are creating the list. They know the streets better than anybody else. In Elmhurst, that's how we kind of start our list every year. Our street superintendent, based on the budget, puts together a list of streets they think they can do. And one of our engineering staff members, Aaron, who's in the back row on the right there, he works as our street superintendent to kind of discuss that list. Maybe there's some mutual tweaks I want to make to group streets and neighborhoods for a little bit more efficiency, things like that. So we're a little bit probably behind the 8 ball compared to most communities in this instance with the pavement management program.
Thank you.
All right, so for the Village of Montgomery, we do have a pavement management program. We have a 5-year program that we roll out to our village board Typically, what we'll do is, though, we reevaluate that each and every year after our program is completed to make sure and ensure that that we're attacking the roads appropriately with the data supported, but also allowing for flexibility as things like these guys have mentioned when it comes to water main replacement or sanitary replacements, do we need to flex and deviate from that plan? So each year we come back to the village board with a final plan, even though it generally follows that 5-year outline, and just reaffirm things with them. At the end of that 4-year mark, then we typically start revisiting our next 5-year plan, start looking at data, driving the streets, again, utilizing superintendents and engineering consultants to evaluate roads to make sure that we're identifying the correct areas that we want to attack in the coming years. So that's a major part of our process that we use in Montgomery.
Thank you, guys. We see quite a diversity in experience in how they're pursuing that, and that's a great resource for you all when and if you're ready to go forward. So we talked a lot about pavement maintenance. Can you speak to how pavement maintenance is viewed in your annual road program? And if you're doing any pavement maintenance as part of your annual program, and if so, what?
We are doing pavement maintenance, but it's primarily limited to pavement striping and pavement crack sealing and crack filling. We haven't done any microsurfacing or rejuvenator or using the rejuvenator products out there on the market. I am certainly interested in those, but I think I'm kind of waiting for the state to take the lead and approve that product and let us use our MFT dollars towards that. So that's kind of the way the funding sources work in North Aurora. We kind of spend most of the MFT on that preventative maintenance as opposed to the capital funds. Everybody, I mean, a lot of communities do crack filling. So, I mean, I think in theory it definitely works. I mean, you're trying to seal out the water from getting to the base of the pavement, and you know, there's a lot to say about that. There's also sometimes there can be some pitfalls of that when you might have the kids on their bikes riding down the streets right after the crack filling, and they're pulling it all right out of the cracks, and then you're kind of either calling the contractor back for repairs or just kind of living without to some extent. But I think preventive maintenance definitely has a role in the overall strategy the preventive maintenance has a role in your overall paving maintenance plan. And I think, you know, in the long term, it's going to be beneficial to the community to undertake some of those.
Yeah, the city of Elmhurst definitely has annual dollars every year for pavement management, maintenance, if you will. We use Reclamite. We spend about $200,000 a year on that, and that's a product we've been using for actually decades now. I love pointing people to one street we have in Elmhurst where jurisdictional boundaries down the center of the road. So it's half Elmhurst, half Berkeley. When we first reclamited the street after we paved, we asked Berkeley if they wanted to, as far as I understand, asked them if they wanted to participate in reclamining their side, and I think they declined. And decades later, if you look at the street on Google Earth, it's night and day. The Elmhurst side with Reclamite has held up very well, the other side has not. So we are a big proponent of using Reclamite, and we apply it usually the same year we pave, which the residents hate. They look at you like, what the heck are you doing? But we found that the initial application in what we call year 0 is really beneficial. If we can't do it that year, we always do it the next year, which would be year 1. And then currently we, at year 5 of that pavement life, we do Reclamite again. So that's one thing we push to other communities to consider it. Certainly it's a tool in everybody's tool bag. And then we also use I'm sure everybody does, the hot crack sealing. We do in-house crack sealing ourselves, and then we do seal coating of our parking lots. We found that that's pretty low dollars, but it goes a long way with those municipal lots. The other thing I'd say that we're unique is we have about 100 tear downs a year in Elmhurst. New older homes are being torn down, and new $1 million big houses are going up, and so you can imagine what that does to your streets. So a lot of our streets look like Swiss cheese just because there's so much patching. We've decided that we're not going to push that onto the builder, so we have quality control with our patching for the new homes, so that's their utility disconnects and connections. And so we actually tack on a fee to their building permit. And the city is doing the patching in-house initially with our staff, and then we have a contractor go and do a final patch the next year to make sure there's no settlement. So most communities, you wouldn't think patching related to new homes is part of your maintenance efforts, but in our community, because you might have 4 new homes on one block in 1 year, we really truly feel it is.
Great idea.
All right, so similar to Elmhurst, the Village of Montgomery does use Reclamite as well, a rejuvenator. We, however, do that in the post-year after paving is how we attack it in Montgomery. That's been shown to be very beneficial for us. There's several things that have really worked out well for us. Number one is doing it in that year after. We allow for the material to settle a little bit to ensure that everything is in place as far as the road resurfacing project goes. So again, as you mentioned, not taxing the residents right away again in the same construction season, but again, we're hitting them right then the year after. So, but the process is pretty straightforward, pretty streamlined, at least in our experience. We haven't had too many issues with it, and it's worked pretty well. Again, in Montgomery, we use the traditional crack sealing as well as part of our maintenance program. Along with, we put in a pretty decent sized quantity each year into our program for patching work and large patching in areas to help extend the life of the roads. So those are the basis of our maintenance program.
Thank you, Mark. I recall during my time as the Public Works Director that there were some challenges in the annual road program, and it seemed like every year those challenges presented themselves, and it just seemed like it was hard to get a solution implemented in some of those challenges. And so I've asked the panelists to help us to understand maybe some of the challenges that they have in association with their annual road program. So John, can you get us started?
Yeah, I think more recently than design or construction management or anything, we've actually been, I think, having a little bit more of a difficult time communicating effectively with our residents. So trying to get the road program announcement out there early enough to let people understand what you're going to be doing and how you're going to be doing it, and also why. You're still going to get those Facebook complaints probably of somebody telling you have no idea what you're doing and the road's fine, and then 10 minutes later somebody else is saying this is the greatest project in the entire world. And it's trying to just navigate that balance and figure out what's the right amount of communication with the residents and what's over communicating. I guess there's certain times maybe too many details is not the greatest, and at the same time not enough details can be detrimental to your efforts as well. I think the most recent challenge for us has just been the restoration aspect of a project, and it's kind of been the timing, really. I mean, the overall project went exceptionally well, and it actually finished ahead of time and ahead of schedule, but it also finished in a time when it wasn't conducive for seed to germinate or grow effectively. So while the overall project and the hardscape was completed on time and looked great, we were at a point where the seed never germinated, the weeds grew, the residents weren't, we didn't explain to the residents how much watering needed to be done, and we were kind of caught in a trick bag with that. So I'm open to suggestions if anybody has any, but we've tried to exhaust sending letters, knocking on doors, taking calls, explaining things at public meetings, and utilizing social media to the best of our efforts, but I think we just kind of keep falling behind a little bit in that area.
Yeah, I think we have very similar themes, and I'm sure all the 3 panelists can share that sentiment. I guess 2 challenges that I would say is we try to stretch our dollars enough to get as many miles as we can paved every year, so we've been concentrating on just milling overlays for what seems like decades. Unfortunately, lately, those streets, you can only mill them over so many times, and so we're falling into recons that we didn't plan for. So, for example, a street looks great from topside, looks like it's a candidate to mill and overlay again, probably for the third time. But when we get into it, we mill, and then you have the heavy trucks on it, it starts to fall apart. That can eat into your budget considerably and cost you $50,000 to $100,000 you weren't expecting when you have to come and hog out the road and build it back up with PGE and maybe even geotextile fabric. So we're trying to be smarter about a program because really our council is not giving us unlimited dollars. They've kind of been pretty consistent, and yet we know that these recons are going to be more and more relevant, and so our mileage that we're doing every year is going to go down. So that's one thing we're really struggling with right now, and I don't think we have an answer. I would just say, you know, surround yourself with good staff members. I have a couple of engineers here that are fantastic engineers. They have a lot of experience. I really lean on them. Also surround yourself with good consultants, whether it's from a design perspective or geotech. And in particular, geotechs are really important because if you have somebody in your back pocket you can call out on a whim and give you an opinion, it can really save you a lot of money and actually help you make the right decision in the moment. So, and the other challenge I'd say is finding interns. We usually have 4 interns that help us with our roadway program every year, and primarily they pass out notices, they help with quantities. They're not out there making all the decisions, but they are an active member of our community and showing the residents that we have people there. We're not just letting the contractor run wild. The interns we've got the last few years have maybe not been the caliber we've had in the past, and so we're really struggling with that. And the number of candidates too. It's usually we'd have 20, 30 people to pick from for 4. In the last couple of years, we're basically picking from a pool of 4 to 10 people. And a lot of them have no engineering experience, may not have any intern experience at all. So that's something we're struggling with. And even if we wanted to hire consultant REs, even on the private side, everyone's very busy and understaffed too. So our annual program is probably $4 to $5 million depending on the year, and that's a lot of work for one staff member to have on his shoulders. So we rely on those interns to help out, or the consultants if they're available. I see that challenge continuing for a while as the employment market is unpredictable.
Yes. Ken, question for you. Your interns, do you get those through the city intern pool?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Yeah, we hit up the local universities all over the Midwest, and again, in the past we had no problem getting them, but it seems like the number of civil engineering or construction engineering students is down considerably.
Gotcha. Thank you. Mark?
All right, I'll echo some of John's challenges. So communication, I think, is always a tough one. For us, I think we actually, in my opinion, do a really good job of communicating. The problem is that year to year, it always differs. For example, we've had years where the village typically hosts an open house meeting that we try to do it geographically where we're going to be working. For instance, one year we hosted it in our police department, which is on the west side of town, because that's predominantly where most of the paving was taking place that year. We had a huge turnout, probably 40 to 50 people, and great success with the program as far as that year went, because we were able to get that information out. But then in years past, we've also had open house meetings where we've had 1 or 2 people show up. So it's finding the avenue to get the information to the residents, not necessarily due to lack of effort on the village's part. So again, if there's a catch-all to figure out how to get the information out, I'd love to hear it, but we're always, I think, challenged with that. I think everybody in this room is. John also mentioned restoration. That's always been an issue in the past. This year, the village, we switched from traditional seed to a sod, which worked out really well for us. We had just an absolute ton of complaints last year as far as weeds and lack of germination and growth. This year with the sodding, we had little to no complaints, so it worked out well for us. But it's another one of those similar to communication where when the stars align and everything works out and the weather is conducive to it, it works well. And I think this year for us that was the case. But a big part of that was for us enforcing on the contractor and making sure that the watering was being done. We paid for additional watering to ensure that the sod established. So that was a big one for us. Kind of unique, our last challenge that I'll share is unique to our situation was, as I referenced earlier, we get sales tax referendum dollars. And so one of the issues that we're having in Montgomery is that we've caught up to a sense in our paving program with our roads that need to be resurfaced. And so our village board is now seeing where they're kind of saying, okay, where are we going to spend these dollars next? Because as far as resurfacing goes, we're at a point where we're comfortable and we're caught up. So we have some board members who feel that they want to give this money back to the residents, which is not a bad idea, but we have other projects in the queue that we'd like to achieve with these dollars. So trying to educate our board members to what other projects are coming up. As Ken alluded to too, we're trying to educate them and make sure they understand that not every road can just be resurfaced as it comes up in its life cycle. Reconstructs are going to be a thing in the future. And so we have to take those into account as we move forward. So that's one of our big challenges.
So Mark, you just helped us understand that when we meet our roadway goals, the struggle's not over, right? Thank you, Mark. I wondered, has the group tried using virtual meetings in conjunction with the in-person meetings, and how has that worked?
We haven't done virtual meetings really with our residents, specifically to a capital improvements project or program. We have had board meetings during the time of COVID where we were having participation from the audience, so via Zoom and stuff like that, but not necessarily on a work program per se.
We also have not done it for a roadway program, but we've been doing a lot of stormwater improvements, and we tried that. I want to say it was the winter of 20 to 21, where we're still worried about the size of the group getting together. We did a virtual meeting on Zoom, and it actually worked really well. We were able to record it, post it, put it on our city website, so if somebody wanted to watch it later, which there are probably no views, but it was available. So I think there's a time and place depending on the project.
Good. Mark?
So we did similar. We did our IRP open house one year, all virtual during the COVID pandemic. So coincidentally, we had the opposite. We had very little to no participation. I believe we had one resident and 3 trustees that attended the meeting. So in that instance, it didn't work well for us. Last year, we hosted our in-person meeting. We did not do a hybrid model. We didn't see the need for it based upon the year before, lack of participation. So we've just gone with our in-person meeting last year, or this year's program, excuse me.
Great, thanks, guys. So let's cut to the chase. And this is all about stretching your roadway dollars, right? So give us your top secret how you stretch your roadway dollars. Thanks, John.
So I guess the village is pretty much stretches its dollars using leverage through the SDP funding and federal funding. So we try to take the MFT dollars, take that 20% and leverage 80% of a project and try to get the bang that way out of the money we have. I'm going to play devil's advocate and challenge the question a little bit and say, while part of it is stretching the dollar, part of it's also informing your board of the needs of the community. So as a municipal employee, you got to be out there and informing the board saying, hey, CPI is going up at a 3% rate or more each year. We're spending $1.2 million in year one, let's say, of a program, and maybe it's getting us a mile of roadway. What happens in 10 years if we're spending $1.2 million, including CPI? Are we still covering that same distance anymore, or now are we doing half a mile of a road where we could have been doing a mile? So I think there's going to be technologies out there that everybody's going to be trying to take advantage of to, whether it be operational, whether it be on the design side of things, to make design and construction more efficient, but ultimately you're fighting a losing battle if you're not trying to maintain the same amount of money that you have in year one as you do in year 10.
Yeah, excellent points. And I think it is hard to stretch those dollars. It's only so much you can do. I think in Elmhurst, Reclamite is the #1 thing we've been seeing. Dollar for dollar, it's worth its weight in gold in terms of stretching out the life of a road. Another thing we've been trying to do on the strategy side is we've been trying to select streets in groups. Previously, maybe 10 years ago, we would just select the street, didn't matter where it was, it could be one block of a 10-block stretch, we're gonna do that one block just because of the condition. Well, I think recently we started looking at is, if the contractor has to jump around the entire town, and our town is about 10 square miles, they're probably gonna bid it a little bit higher. So how can we be smarter and group streets in a neighborhood and kind of knock out the whole neighborhood? Maybe if it's not in 1 year, but over 2 or 3, and get in and out of there, not disrupt that neighborhood for another 15 to 20 years. So that's a strategy that we've been using. I'm not sure you can really quantify how well that works, but I would say that the contractors have told us that they like that a lot better, and if they like your community, they like the way you're running it, I think they're more inclined to sharpen their pencil when it comes to bidding.
Right.
And then the last thing I'd say is, we've been doing a lot of concrete streets. We've been milling them and overlaying them with asphalt. And I think it felt really odd to us at first. The huge benefit right away is it's a much smoother drive, especially when some of these concrete streets are in industrial parks. But we were worried about the longevity of the street. Are you reducing the structural integrity of the road? So one thing we did is we required saw and seals. So where the underlying joints are in the concrete, after we pave, we come in and saw and seal it, and it's been holding up exceptionally well. We have a couple streets in town where we did not do the saw and seal, and the reflective cracking is all over the place, and then it's really hard for you to do crack sealing. So I'd say saw and seal is another technique we have to try to stretch the life of the road and stretch the dollars.
Thanks, Ken.
All right, I haven't decided if it's the worst being the last, because I just rob everybody else's stuff, but, so, to touch on some of the same things that Ken just mentioned, grouping of the streets is one that we have found in Montgomery that, at least feedback from the contractors, has been an exceptionally good thing for us. Trying to geographically locate to minimize those moves for the contractor and mobilizations has been something that's key. And then also on the contracting perspective is being flexible with your contractor, understanding when decisions need to be made or they have suggestions, that we're willing to compromise and take things into account, while again, you know, as Kyle kind of touched upon this in his presentation, of still being there to be the advocate for the village and make sure that we're getting the quality and scope of work that we want, but also giving flexibility where it comes into place, because at least in our experience, we have found that we tend to get the same contractor preferred by the village each and every year that likes working for us. They're flexible for us. Perfect example was this year we had some patching that kind of came up last minute that we needed done in a certain time frame, and they were more than happy to accommodate us even during the aggregate strike. So it was really kind of a bad timing type situation, but because we had that good relationship with the contractor, because we're flexible, it allowed for us to be able to have that where it helped us out in the long run. I can't remember the other thing that I was gonna talk about, so I'll close with that.
Okay. And we'll start with you.
Okay.
On this next round, I'm going to give you a softball. Is your street program funding adequate? Which you already told us it was, but I'm going to twist it a little bit then on you. How'd you get there? How'd you do that?
So this is perfect, because this is one that the other two communities don't have, so I'll start with this. Again, as I had stated, we use our sales tax referendum was passed in 2014, 1% of sales tax. So the idea is not only that we're putting that on the backs of the residents, but also those who come to the village and are buying goods, groceries, gas, et cetera. So we utilize the IRP funds for our infrastructure road program each and every year. So like I said, that's one of the great things that we had. So one of the things that got us to that point was we had done an evaluation, and this predates me, but this is the data that I have. We basically came up with, it was gonna be a 53-year life or time period before we came back and touched a road at the current funding that we had prior to this referendum that was passed. So we have obviously had a need with the growth that Montgomery had on our west side of town. We couldn't sustain with our with our rehabilitation projects. So that was why we decided to implement this and got the backing from the board, and ultimately the residents approved and agreed it. So that has been huge for us. Again, as I stated before, some of our challenges is now, you know, we've gotten to this catch-up point, but we're starting to try to identify other items such as sanitary lining, storm sewer projects, and potentially water main improvements that we could also use this funding. Wasn't deliberately intended and set up to be just for the roads. That's why we utilize the infrastructure portion of that. So that's how we're doing things currently, and it's working out so far.
Thank you, Mark. I want to highlight something Mark said in that 53-year cycle. And one of those slides near the end of my presentation, I gave that. And with the pavement management program, or even just knowing your per mile costs, based on what we're spending today, this is how long it takes us to get back around to resurfacing a street. And you heard Mark say 53 years. Now, when an alderman or a councilman hears that and they visualize their street 53 years from when it was last surfaced, you have a very compelling argument for why more is needed. So thank you for bringing that up, Mark. And Kent, how about you guys? How are you doing on funding?
I think we're kind of middle of the road right now. We're sufficient. We can get mileage done. I think we'd always like more money. Out in the field, we have to make some really tough decisions on, you know, do we have an extra $1,000 on this block budgeted to do Mrs. Johnson's apron because it's the right thing to do. So I wish we'd have more of a contingency dollar amount so we didn't feel so pressured on every street. Again, as I said, we have on average $4 to $5 million a year. I live in Villa Park, Elmhurst neighbor to the west, and I can tell you the roads are a lot worse, but they did a road referendum a few years ago and they're starting to make headway. So each community is different. Yeah, I guess I'd say I feel comfortable with the dollar amount we have right now, but I think as prices continue to go up, we'll have to go back. We'll have to present some information about the life cycle and try to get them to buy into that. And that will be a little bit of a tough sell, especially these tough times where finances are still hurting at most municipalities, so we'll see how that goes.
Good, thank you.
North Aurora's been improving probably over the last 5 years, so I think just about each year our overall network PCI has been going up, and that's probably a pretty good improvement in the last 5 years. The funding has been sufficient, and I think we've gotten to the point where the actual road network is beginning to drive the dollars allocated instead of kind of the dollars limiting where we can operate throughout town. So I think a lot of the techniques that were shared today in the presentations, like the clustering of the roads and trying to find the appropriate road paving technique for a given road section are really important. I think there still needs to be as much as you could possibly educate your council or board is fantastic. The more they understand and they appreciate the roads and what you're doing, I think they're going to be more receptive to your requests. I'll try anything, to be honest with you. In other communities, like when you used to have CD players in your cars, I'd have the aldermen drive around the community in their cars with their CD player on and see where the CD would skip. And I tell them, yeah, that's probably a bad road that needs to be resurfaced. I've been to finance advisory committees where I do like the Great British Bake-Off show, and I'm not a great baker, but I've taken Rice Krispie treats and used them as a section of road to present to a finance advisory council to explain, the chocolate frosting on the top is your surface, the open graded aggregates, your Rice Krispies, and then you throw another layer on the bottom whenever you want. And while everybody's kind of eating the Rice Krispie treat, they're paying attention to your presentation, hopefully. So whatever you can do to be creative, to get people to understand, infrastructure is important and this is why you should invest in it, I encourage you to do it.
And I'm sure John will be happy to share his recipe with anybody who wants to try. Okay, we have one more, and it's with regard to funding. And have you found any particular difficulties or have you had any particular successes associated with accessing roadway funding? Mark, can we start with you?
Sure. Again, I'll touch on the IRP fund, the sales tax referendum, but the other thing too is that we're still challenged. We're still utilizing STP funds, MFT funds. So in the STP applications, obviously still working against other municipalities that are submitting for those as well. So trying to coordinate those in the queue as far as our 5-year plan goes, along with the other applications that are coming in and the scoring that we receive on the STPs. That's always one of our struggles, is just trying to balance those and making sure that, and that's probably a huge part of what I touched on earlier with our 5-year plan, why we reevaluate it each year. So we get those scores back for the STP projects, and we're able to move some of those roads around depending on when we may see that funding coming along. So that's probably our challenge with funding.
Yeah, we share a lot of the same challenges, if you will. We primarily look to STP funding for grant funds. Because of the economic base in Elmhurst, we're not eligible for a lot of the other grants that are out there. And as I said earlier, because of our high ADTs with being surrounded by freeways and all the apps sending people through, don't drive through Elmhurst on a Friday afternoon, by the way. We've been really lucky on STP funding, and we have used Rebuild Illinois funds over the last couple of years to extend some, or to be allocated towards some recons that we're working on, so that has helped a little bit too. The one thing I'd say is, I'm kind of shifting gears into a separate comment, but with the grant funding, we're seeing that we need to plan multiple years in advance from what we used to. A lot of that, I think, is IDOT is overrun with processing of grant applications and everything they do. And we are concerned with potentially additional dollars coming from the federal government. What is that going to do to the strain on IDOT? So right now we're looking, when we apply for an STP project, we're asking to be on the back end of the 5-year application for our council. And so we're looking 4 to 5 years out for a project. And I feel pretty comfortable with that. But if you had a complex project that had a lot of environmental or something else, I'm starting to worry that 4 years may not be enough to get through the process if you're not on schedule and on task all the time with, again, how understaffed IDOT is and all the paperwork that needs to go through them.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the position where Kent is. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I'm supporting that strategy wholeheartedly. Plan ahead as best you can. Identify what's unique to your community's road network. If there's something, that stands out that's going to make your community more attractive for a grant application from DCEO, highlight it as best you can. There's a intersection in our town that's right next to a police station, and down the road is a hospital in the neighboring town. Maybe that's a compelling reason for IDOT to want to contribute funding to this intersection program so that our emergency response can be more effective and lower. So it's not always unique to find or easy to find, but if you can highlight those things and plan in advance, get your designs through phase 1 and maybe into phase 2, make your grant applications as easy as possible for those reviewing them to just say, hey, this is the community that I want to support with this funding. That's probably the best advice I'd have.